A parasite. Get out of our house. They thought they were finally cutting the dead weight. They smiled as they locked the front door, fully believing they had secured my late grandpa's entire legacy for themselves. What they didn't know was that I had already visited his attorney the morning before. They thought they were throwing away a helpless daughter, but in reality, they were walking straight into a legal trap my grandfather spent his final months perfectly engineering. I'm glad I kept his true intentions a secret, because a week later, what his attorney revealed about my parents' past shocked me to the core and stripped them of absolutely everything. Follow my story until the end to see how the greedy are watching from so I can see how far the story has reached. My name is Georgina, and at 31 years old, I finally learned what it feels like to be completely cast aside by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The funeral flowers for my grandfather were barely wilting when my parents decided it was time to purge me from their lives. I stood in the middle of the gravel driveway, watching in absolute disbelief as my father hauled my heavy canvas suitcases out of the front door and threw them onto the ground. The sharp crack of the plastic handles splitting against the stone echoed through the quiet neighborhood. My mother stood on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her designer blouse, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. You've spent years freeloading under our roof, pretending to care about your grandfather just to stay comfortable, my father shouted, his voice dripping with venom. But his estate, the family business, the $20 million legacy, everything goes to us. You are a parasite, Georgina, and we are finally cutting the dead weight. Get out of our house. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought that by kicking me out, they were securing the entire inheritance for themselves and eliminating any chance of me asking for a single cent. They even smiled as my father stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut, locking it with a definitive click. It was a humiliating, heartbreaking moment, but beneath the sting of their cruelty, a strange calmness washed over me. I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to reconsider. Why? Because I was harboring a massive secret. I didn't tell my parents that the morning before the funeral, I had already visited my grandfather's private attorney. I knew the exact contents of the real will. As I quietly packed my cracked suitcases into the trunk of my car, I chose to stay completely silent, letting them enjoy their temporary illusion of victory. They thought they were throwing away a helpless daughter, but they had no idea they were walking straight into a meticulously engineered legal trap. The sound of my engine starting was the cue for my parents to begin celebrating. From my rearview mirror, I watched the front curtains twitch as my mother poured 2 glasses of expensive champagne. Over the next 48 hours, their greed completely manifested. They went on an immediate, reckless spending spree, putting down a massive deposit on a luxury European sports car and contacting real estate agents to put Grandpa's beloved lakefront properties on the market. They were operating under the grand illusion of absolute victory, convinced that their inheritance was a done deal and that I had been successfully erased from the family legacy. But as I sat in a cramped, cheap motel room that night, looking at the neon sign blinking outside my window, I didn't feel defeated. I closed my eyes and smiled, reflecting on my grandfather during his final months. While my parents were busy traveling and ignoring his declining health, I had been the one holding his hand in the hospital, making sure he was comfortable and listening to his stories. Grandpa wasn't blind. He saw right through his own children's shallow entitlement and cold manipulation. He knew exactly what they would do to me the moment he passed away. Reaching into my purse, I pulled out a heavy, mysterious brass safety deposit box key and a crisp business card left to me by a private attorney my parents didn't even know existed. Grandpa had handed them to me during our very last conversation, whispering that justice would prevail. The trap was set, and my parents were happily walking right into it. The next morning, I drove down to Midtown and stepped into the law office of Arthur Pendleton, the sharp, tight-lipped attorney my grandfather had hired completely behind my parents' backs. The office wasn't grand or flashy, like the one my parents' corporate lawyers used, but it radiated a sense of absolute authority and quiet precision. Arthur was waiting for me, a thick, bound manila folder resting squarely in the center of his mahogany desk. He looked at me with a mixture of profound sympathy and intense professional focus as I took a seat across from him, clutching the small brass key in my hand. "Georgina," Arthur began, his voice calm and completely steady. "Your grandfather knew exactly what your parents would do. He anticipated our cruelty, and he spent his final months ensuring they wouldn't get away with it." With theatrical precision, he opened the thick folder and officially revealed the true contents of the will. My grandfather hadn't left his $20 million fortune to his children. He had left the entire estate, the properties, the liquid investments, and the family assets exclusively to me. I was the sole heir to everything. I sat there in stunned silence, a massive wave of relief washing over me. But before I could even speak, Arthur raised a hand, his expression turning deeply serious. "There's a catch, Georgina," he explained. "Your grandfather knew your parents would try to aggressively manipulate or exploit you the moment he passed away. Because of that, he added a very specific, ironclad clause to this document designed to test their true nature one final time. They had to choose how to treat you, and by throwing you out, they have officially activated the next phase of his plan." Arthur leaned forward and pulled a second, separate file from his desk drawer. It was labeled with the words "Confidential Forensics." Using the small brass key I had brought with me, he unlocked a secure steel lockbox beside his desk and pulled out a thumb drive containing backup files, setting it down right beside the paperwork. "Your grandfather didn't just want to protect his money, Georgina," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a serious whisper. "He wanted to make sure they could never legally challenge you. To do that, he unraveled a dark truth about your parents' past." He opened the file, revealing a mountain of old financial spreadsheets, bank statements, and private investigator reports gathered by Grandpa before his passing. As I skimmed the pages, my blood grew cold. Years ago, when Grandpa's logistics business was at its peak, my parents had systematically committed severe financial fraud against him, offshore accounts, to fund their failing lifestyles. But the most sickening part was what they did when Grandpa first began showing signs of a minor heart condition. To cover up their embezzlement, they had secretly tried to alter his early medical records, bribing a corrupt medical assistant to state that Grandpa was suffering from severe cognitive decline and lacked mental capacity. They wanted to force him out of his own company and take total control. Grandpa discovered their betrayal back then but chose to stay quiet, methodically gathering undeniable proof of their grand larceny and elder abuse. He kept this evidence hidden away for years, waiting for the perfect moment to use it as absolute leverage to protect my future. "This is where your grandfather's true genius comes into play," Arthur said, a faint, calculating smile touching his lips as he flipped to the final pages of the legal folder. He explained that Grandpa had created a brilliant poison pill mechanism directly inside the final will, specifically targeting my parents' insatiable greed. On paper, Grandpa didn't just leave his $20 million fortune to me. He also set up a seemingly massive corporate logistics shell company, heavily implied to be filled with valuable family assets, and left it explicitly to my parents. However, it was a beautifully designed trap. That shell company was actually completely hollow, tied directly to $3 million of unresolved debt, back taxes, and severe legal liabilities stemming from my parents' past fraudulent activities. Grandpa had quietly consolidated all their old financial crimes and liabilities into this single entity. Arthur looked at me intently and delivered the ultimatum. If my parents accepted the estate distribution gracefully and left me alone, the shell company would dissolve quietly. But if they aggressively tried to claim the entire estate, block my inheritance, or challenge the paperwork, they would automatically trigger absolute, personal ownership of that toxic shell company. By doing so, they would become entirely, legally liable for the mountain of debt and face immediate criminal exposure for the past fraud. They would literally be signing their own financial death warrant. I took a deep breath, looking at the documents that held the power to completely shatter my parents' lives. They had thrown me out like garbage, and now it was time for them to face the consequences. I looked at Arthur and gave him the green light to schedule the formal reading. The grand conference room at Pendleton and Associates felt completely suffocating as we all gathered for the formal reading of the will. My parents swaggered into the room, looking incredibly smug and condescending. They had brought along their own aggressive, highly paid corporate lawyer, a man who smiled at me with cold pity as they took their seats across the polished mahogany table. My mother looked at my plain clothes and scoffed, whispering loudly to my father that I was probably here to beg for a handout. Their attorney confidently slid forward an outdated copy of an early estate document, fully believing they were about to officially secure their $20 million victory. But the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly when Arthur Pendleton opened his briefcase and laid out the final, legally binding will alongside the confidential forensics file. He handed a copy to their lawyer, who began skimming the pages with a practiced, arrogant smile. Within seconds, that smile completely vanished. I watched in absolute fascination as all the color drained from their attorney's face. His hands began to visibly shake, and he turned completely pale, staring at my parents with pure horror. "What is it?" my father demanded, his confident facade beginning to crack. "Read it out loud." Their lawyer swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "There's been a catastrophic mistake. This document is ironclad, and it supersedes everything. Georgina inherits the entire $20 million fortune. You inherit nothing but the logistics shell company." The room went dead silent as the terrifying truth settled in. By aggressively pushing for the estate and throwing me out, my parents had legally triggered the poison pill. They hadn't won an empire. They had just inherited millions in toxic debt and immediate criminal exposure. The collapse of my parents' carefully constructed world happened with terrifying speed. Unable to afford the massive debts attached to the shell company, they were forced into a humiliating bankruptcy, losing their home, their luxury cars, and their social standing. They are currently under active federal investigation for past financial crimes, facing the very real possibility of prison time. Meanwhile, I used my grandfather's $20 million legacy to build a quiet, peaceful life. I bought a beautiful home and established the Georgina Legacy Foundation, which provides legal defense and financial protection for vulnerable elders who are exploited by greedy family members. Now, I'm curious about you who listen to my story. What would you do leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that will definitely